The lock on my cabin door wouldn't catch. Marcus watched from his porch as I wrestled with it, then rolled down his window just enough to shout, "Try not to burn the place down! Failure, boy!" His girlfriend, this month's version, giggled on cue. Behind them, my sister Vanessa was already filming my struggle on her phone, probably for her Instagram story with some clever caption about family embarrassments. What they didn't know, what would shatter their perfect little world in exactly 48 hours, was that the signature on every deed, every water right, every mineral claim on this 11,000-acre Colorado property was mine. And I had invited them here specifically to watch their greed destroy them. Before we go any further, grab your coffee, settle into your seat, and if you're enjoying this story of patience, justice, and family drama, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. My name is Alex Hartley, and I'm 38 years old, though my family still treats me like I'm 12 and useless. This wasn't supposed to be my inheritance. Hell, according to everyone at the reading of Aunt Celia's will 4 years ago, I wasn't supposed to get anything at all. Aunt Celia had been the matriarch, the one who'd turned a failing cattle operation into a resort destination that brought in 8 figures annually. Everyone assumed the estate would go to my father, Richard, the golden child, the business genius, the man who'd leveraged Aunt Celia's early success into his own real estate empire. The lawyer had other news that day, news that would change everything about how my family saw me, though they wouldn't know it for 4 long years. I still remember the stunned silence when he read the actual beneficiary. Alex Hartley, not Richard, not Vanessa with her MBA from Harvard, not Marcus with his tech startup connections. Me, the one who'd dropped out of college, who worked as a park ranger, who showed up to family gatherings in hiking boots and flannel, while everyone else wore designer labels worth more than my yearly salary. But Aunt Celia's will had one ironclad condition that made all the difference. I couldn't reveal the inheritance for 4 full years. She wanted to see, she wrote in her letter to me, whether the family would show their true nature when they thought they owned everything. She wanted me to have ammunition, evidence, undeniable proof of who they really were beneath the holiday smiles and birthday cards. So I waited, I watched, and I documented everything with the patience of someone who knew the truth would eventually set everything right. Now, as I finally kicked my cabin door open and stepped into a room that smelled like mildew and mouse droppings, I smiled because the trap was set, and they had walked right into it. The property manager who greeted my family wasn't actually a property manager. His name was Ray Chen, and he'd been Aunt Celia's head of operations for 15 years. Now he worked for me, though my family had no idea as they accepted their cabin assignments with the casual entitlement of people who believed they owned the world. The main lodge with 8 bedrooms and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Crystal Lake went to my parents naturally, while the Alpine Suite, with its private hot tub, went to Vanessa and her husband Trevor. Marcus got the Meadow house with all its smart home technology, and for me, Ray apologized profusely as he handed over a key attached to actual twine, explaining that Cabin 7 was all that remained, the old shepherd's quarters from the 70s where the roof leaked, the plumbing was temperamental, and there might be rats. My mother didn't even look at me when she said someone had to take it, and I was used to roughing it anyway, while Marcus laughed and called it job training for my park ranger career, and they all drove off toward their luxury accommodations, leaving me standing in the dust with a duffel bag and a key that looked medieval. Ray waited until their cars disappeared around the bend, before his professional mask cracked into a genuine grin, asking if he'd laid it on thick enough. And I told him it was Academy Award worthy before confirming that everything else was ready for tomorrow's carefully orchestrated revelations. Dinner that evening was served on the main lodge's wraparound deck, catered by a restaurant 2 towns over that charged $300 per person, all ordered by my father, using what he thought was his money from estate accounts I actually controlled. I arrived 15 minutes late, still wearing my hiking clothes, because the shower in Cabin 7 had produced exactly 3 minutes of lukewarm water before giving up entirely, and the only empty seat was at the far end of the table between two unused serving platters, where I belonged in their eyes. My father stood with his wine glass raised, toasting Aunt Celia, and then immediately pivoting to toast the family who would carry her legacy forward into an even more profitable future. And I noticed no one actually looked sad about her being gone. They looked excited, calculating, already spending money they hadn't earned and would never receive. The conversation quickly turned to arguments about the property's future, with Vanessa pushing for subdivision and development along the corridor between Aspen and Vale. My father insisting the real value was in selling everything intact for 60 to 80 million. And Marcus pitching some venture fund scheme involving wellness retreats and celebrity weddings that would supposedly generate 9 figures in 5 years. They argued through 3 courses while I sat silently at my end of the table. Furniture, essentially, present but completely irrelevant to their grand schemes and calculations. No one asked about my opinion on the land I actually owned. No one asked about my life or my work, or whether I'd even been able to get my cabin door to lock properly. And I watched them reveal themselves exactly as Aunt Celia had predicted they would. Around 10 that evening, as dessert was being cleared, my mother finally acknowledged my existence by asking if I could handle a horseback tour for some potential investors the next morning, people who knew Aunt Celia and needed to see the property. And she reminded me to try to shower and maybe borrow a clean shirt from Marcus, because first impressions mattered. I excused myself and walked back toward cabin 7, under a sky absolutely littered with stars you could never see in a city. And Ray was waiting on my porch with 2 beers in hand. He started to tell me about tomorrow morning's guests, but I interrupted to say I knew who they were because I had invited them, and we needed to make sure everything went exactly according to plan. I was already mounted on Ranger, my personal horse, though my family didn't know that, when they emerged from their cabins the next morning at 7:55, with Vanessa wearing designer riding boots that had clearly never seen a stable, and Marcus sporting sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ray had saddled horses for everyone, and by the time my mother needed a mounting block and 2 attempts to get situated, and Marcus's girlfriend Madison refused to go entirely, citing a fear of large animals with attitudes, it was almost 8:30, which meant we'd be exactly where I needed us to be when the first disruption arrived, right on schedule. I led them along the ridge trail, pointing out the expanded pastures where Aunt Celia had introduced heritage breed cattle, the solar array, powering 60% of the resort's electricity, and the water reclamation system that had won state environmental awards. But my father barely listened, as he texted someone about preliminary valuations. We rounded the bend near Eagle Point just as a truck pulled up with perfect timing, the side panel reading, Hartley Environmental Consulting, with my name clearly displayed as owner, and my father's voice went sharp, asking what the hell my name was doing on that truck. I shrugged and said it was freelance work, environmental impact assessments, and before anyone could process that, the driver, actually my business partner Lisa, hopped out, waving a folder about watershed reports I'd requested for the Northern Expansion Project, mentioning casually that the owner had approved everything, and we were good to start. Phase 2. The silence that followed was exquisite, as my father's face went pale, and he started to say he was the owner before stopping himself too late, while Lisa looked perfectly, deliberately confused, and checked her paperwork to confirm that Alex Hartley had been the property owner for 4 years now, according to all our contracts. Marcus recovered first, insisting it was impossible because Aunt Celia's estate went to Dad, and they were all at the will reading. But I asked mildly whether they'd actually stayed for the whole thing or left right after hearing her primary assets were going to a single beneficiary before the lawyer said the actual name. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a fish, because she'd been the first one out the door that day, too devastated by not being chosen to hear who actually was chosen, and my mother's voice came out as a whisper, asking what Lisa was talking about. I dismounted from Ranger slowly giving them time to process. And from my saddlebag, I pulled out the waterproof folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. The deed with my name. The will with my inheritance clearly stated 4 years of tax payments, all made by me, and business licenses for every operation on the land, all under my ownership. My father looked through it with shaking hands, his face cycling through disbelief and confusion before landing on rage, insisting these documents were forged, and this was fraud. But I calmly explained it was all verified by 3 different law firms and the county assessor's office, and he could call them right now if he wanted, because Ray had all the numbers. My father shouted that Ray worked for him, and I corrected him quietly to say Ray worked for the property owner, which was me, had been for 4 years, and he'd been sending information I approved, scheduling visits I allowed, and managing accounts I funded this entire time. Vanessa had her phone out already dialing her lawyer, while Marcus just stared at me like I'd grown a second head, saying I was nobody, the family screw-up who worked for the Park Service. I told him I worked for the Park Service because I loved conservation, not because I couldn't do anything else, and that Aunt Celia understood I measured worth in legacy and preservation, and actually caring about the land instead of just what could be extracted from it. My mother started crying, angry tears, demanding to know how Celia could do this to her own niece and nephew, leaving everything to someone who'd never accomplished anything. And that stung, but I'd been expecting it. A second vehicle arrived right on cue, containing James Wu, Aunt Celia's personal attorney, and Sharon Martinez, a land trust representative I'd been working with for 3 years. And James approached my family with professional sympathy that didn't reach his eyes as he apologized for any confusion and invited them to contest the will if they wanted, though he should warn them that Celia had anticipated that possibility. My father demanded to know what possible reasoning she could have for cutting out her entire family except for me, and James pulled out his phone to play a video that made everyone go silent. Aunt Celia's face filled the screen, recorded 6 months before she died, looking directly at the camera with those sharp eyes that never missed anything. And she explained that she'd watched my father turn her business success into his own fortune, without once thanking her. Watched Vanessa use her connections, then ghost her during her illness. Watched Marcus borrow $50,000 and never repay it, or even acknowledge the debt. She said she'd watched me visit every single month for 10 years, not because I wanted money, but because I wanted to know her, because I learned the land and understood what she built and why, because I saw beyond profit to purpose. And yes, Richard, she'd cut them all out, except the one person who actually deserved what she had to give. The video ended, and my father's face had gone from red to white. Vanessa had stopped mid-dial on her phone, and Marcus looked like he'd been punched, while my mother weakly protested that they'd visited and called. I told her I knew exactly how many times because I was there, and I'd counted. 4 calls in the last year of her life. 2 visits, both to discuss the will and what they might inherit, never asking how she felt or what they could do to help, treating her like a bank account with a pulse. They didn't come to lunch, with Ray reporting that Vanessa had locked herself in her cabin making frantic legal calls. My parents had driven to town probably searching for their own representation, and Marcus had taken Madison and left entirely, his Porsche spitting gravel as he peeled out. I spent the afternoon doing what I actually loved, riding fence lines, checking on cattle, talking with ranch hands who'd known the truth all along, because Aunt Celia had told them immediately after changing her will that Alex was the future here, and to treat him accordingly. Around 5, Ray found me near the southern pasture to say my mother wanted to talk alone at Cabin 7, and I found her sitting on my crooked porch, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Expensive resort wear out of place against weathered wood and overgrown wildflowers. She told me without preamble that my father was filing a lawsuit, and Vanessa had found a firm that thought they could challenge based on mental competency, claiming Aunt Celia wasn't of sound mind when she changed the will. But I said they'd lose because she'd had 3 doctors evaluate her specifically to prevent that argument, and James had all the documentation to prove it. My mother nodded slowly and said she'd always known they'd lose if it came to this because Celia was nothing if not thorough, then asked if I could answer something honestly. Had I done this for revenge? Was this about hurting them? I sat down beside her on the same steps where Aunt Celia had taught me to identify bird calls, where she told me stories about my great-grandfather who first homesteaded this land, where she'd cried, telling me about her own children who'd stopped speaking to her years ago over money. And I said no. This was about preservation. I explained that Aunt Celia built something beautiful here, not just profitable, but meaningful. A place where the land mattered more than development potential, where conservation wasn't just a tax write-off, and she knew that if Dad got control, he'd sell to the highest bidder within a year. If Vanessa got it, she'd turn it into some performative influencer destination. And if Marcus got it, he probably wouldn't even remember he owned it between investment opportunities. My mother asked what I would do with it, and I told her what I'd been doing for 4 years. Running the resort sustainably, expanding land trust protections, opening parts for research and education, using the money Aunt Celia left me to keep this place running, exactly as she envisioned, for the rest of my life. Then I surprised her by saying I wasn't keeping everyone completely out, that I was establishing a family trust where everyone would get a small annual distribution, not millions, but enough to be meaningful, in exchange for committing to 2 weeks every year working here, actually working, mucking stalls, mending fences, learning what this land needs instead of what they can take from it. She said my father would never agree to that, and I nodded, knowing Vanessa probably wouldn't either, and Marcus definitely wouldn't. But then, I looked at her directly and said she could. She was quiet for a long time while the sun set, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, and an eagle called from somewhere overhead. And finally she said she didn't know how to muck a stall. I told her I'd teach her. And when she protested that she hadn't done physical labor in 30 years, I said it was never too late to start. She laughed, a broken sound that might have been a sob, saying my father would divorce her if she agreed, and Vanessa would stop speaking to her, and she'd be the family pariah. But I offered gently that she could also be the one person who chose growth over greed, connection over cash, legacy over lawsuit. Her choice to make. My mother stayed for dinner that evening, just the 2 of us eating sandwiches on Cabin 7's porch, while stars emerged one by one. And she told me things I'd never heard about her own parents who'd valued achievement over everything, about how she'd learned to measure love in accomplishments, because that's what had been modeled for her. She explained how she'd convinced herself that ignoring me was fine because I seemed content, and content children were less work than ambitious ones, then quickly added that wasn't an excuse, just context for why she'd failed me so completely. I said she hadn't failed me completely. She'd just failed to see me, and there was a difference worth understanding. She cried real tears then, not the angry ones from earlier. And I didn't hug her because forgiveness wasn't something I could give in a single evening, but I sat beside her and let her cry. And that was something neither of us had expected to share. My father left the next morning without speaking to me, having apparently spent the night drafting a legal response that James Wu politely informed him was dead on arrival, while Vanessa left shortly after with vague Instagram posts about family betrayal and fighting for what's right. And Marcus sent a text saying this was messed up, but he got it, and good luck with the ranch or whatever. Not an apology, but from Marcus, probably the closest I'd ever get. My mother stayed the entire week she'd planned, with Ray finding her work boots and teaching gloves, while I showed her how to check water troughs, recognize signs of illness in cattle, and walk fence lines looking for breaks. She complained constantly, discovered muscles she'd forgotten existed, and asked surprisingly good questions about ranch operations that showed she was actually trying to understand rather than just endure. On her last evening, we rode out to Eagle Point together, her significantly better in the saddle than 6 days earlier. And she said she was coming back, not for the trust distribution, but for this, gesturing at the landscape and saying she'd forgotten how quiet the world could be, how much space existed when you weren't constantly performing. I told her the cabin was hers whenever she wanted it, and I'd even fixed the shower, and she smiled tentative but genuine, then asked why I'd waited so long to reveal the truth instead of doing it immediately. I explained that Aunt Celia's condition wasn't punishment, but education. She wanted them to show who they really were when they thought they had power, wanted me to see it too, and understand that people we love can also hurt us most, not always out of malice, but out of neglect, ignorance, and entitlement. And she wanted to give me time to decide whether winning was worth losing them all forever. My mother asked what I'd decided, and I told her I'd rather have one honest relationship than 4 fake ones, that if that one was her, I'd take it. And if it was no one, then I had this land and this work, and Aunt Celia's legacy, which was more than most people get in a lifetime. We rode back as the first stars appeared, and she left the next morning with a hug that lasted longer than any in my memory, and a promise to return in 6 weeks, though I didn't know if she would or if my father would ever speak to me again, or if Vanessa would drop her legal threats, or if Marcus would even remember this weekend, a year from now. But I knew as I stood on the porch of Cabin 7 that night, looking out over 11,000 acres of protected land, that I felt something I'd never expected. Not triumph, not vindication, but peace. The hovel they'd given me to humiliate me had become my home. The inheritance they'd tried to steal had become my purpose. And that, in the end, was worth more than all their approval combined or any amount of money they'd been counting on to validate their existence. 6 months later, my mother kept her promise and had been back 4 times, staying longer each visit, becoming friends with Ray's wife, and starting a photography project documenting the ranch's wildlife, while actually convincing 2 of her friends to book conservation volunteer vacations here. My father and I exchanged emails through lawyers for 3 months before the correspondence just stopped, his lawsuit dismissed, and his attention moved on to other ventures. And we weren't reconciled, but we weren't actively at war, which was something neither of us had expected. Vanessa sent me a card on my birthday, unsigned, but with a photo of her on a hiking trail with no message, just the image. And I thought it might be her way of saying she was trying to understand what I valued, even if she didn't value it herself. And I decided to take it as the olive branch it might have been. Marcus called last month drunk, asking if he could bring his new girlfriend to the ranch because she was actually cool and wanted to meet his real family, not the performance version. And I said yes, without hesitation, because people deserve chances to grow, even when they've spent years proving they won't. I did fix the shower in Cabin 7 eventually, but I still live here in the place they thought was an insult, in the structure they assigned me, hoping I'd feel small and diminished and appropriately put in my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. The cabin sits on the same land where my great-grandfather first staked his claim during the Depression, where Aunt Celia spent countless evenings teaching me about conservation and legacy, where I learned that worth isn't measured in dollar signs or job titles or how many followers watch your curated life online. Every morning, I wake up to mountains that have stood for millions of years and will stand for millions more, completely indifferent to human schemes and inheritance disputes and family drama. Every evening I sit on this crooked porch and watch the sun set over land that I don't really own in any permanent sense. I'm just its current steward, responsible for protecting it so future generations can experience what I'm experiencing right now in this perfect moment of stillness. Aunt Celia was right about everything, it turns out. The best inheritance isn't money or land or the satisfaction of revenge against people who underestimated you. The best inheritance is knowing exactly who you are when everyone else has decided you're nobody, and then choosing grace anyway when you finally have the power to prove them wrong. It's understanding that the people who hurt you aren't always villains. Sometimes they're just broken in ways that made them unable to see your value. And healing is possible when someone finally decides to stop performing and start being honest. So, yes, they gave me the worst hovel on the property, thinking it was an insult, never knowing I owned the ranch, never imagining that their cruelty would become the foundation for something better than any of us expected. And now, 6 months later, as my mother's photographs hang in the main lodge, and Marcus's girlfriend asks intelligent questions about sustainable ranching, and even Vanessa's Instagram shows more hiking trails than designer boutiques, I realize that Aunt Celia didn't just leave me land. She left me the possibility of transformation for myself and for anyone willing to do the work. That's the real inheritance, the one that matters long after lawyers and lawsuits fade into memory. And I'm grateful every single day for the wisdom to recognize it.